The night in Westbrook was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing. It was a Tuesday, or maybe very early Wednesday morning, around 2 o'clock. The streetlights were the only things awake, casting long yellow shadows on the empty pavement. Most of the houses in this part of town were big and set back far from the road, with long driveways and manicured lawns that looked like carpets even in the dark. David Springer sat in his patrol car, keeping the engine running just low enough to stay warm, but quiet enough to hear the world outside. He had been a police officer for a long time, long enough to know that nothing good happens after 2 in the morning. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup and squinted through the windshield. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just watching, waiting. That was the job. You drove around, you checked doors, you made sure the world was still turning the way it was supposed to. Then he saw it. A car was coming down the main road. It wasn't speeding, but it wasn't driving normally either. It was a beige Ford Thunderbird, a nice car, vintage, but clearly taken care of. It had that shine that said it had just been waxed, even at this hour. As the car passed under a streetlight, David noticed the way it was moving. It drifted a little too close to the center line, then corrected itself sharply. Then it drifted toward the curb. It was the kind of driving that usually meant the driver was very tired. Or maybe they had too much to drink at a late-night dinner. David put his coffee back in the cup holder and flicked on his lights. He didn't turn the siren on yet because he didn't want to wake up the whole neighborhood. He just wanted to pull the car over, check the driver, and make sure everyone was safe. The Thunderbird slowed down and signaled, pulling over to the side of the road smoothly. That was a good sign. Usually drunk drivers jerk the wheel or take forever to stop. This person stopped, like they were parking at a grocery store. David let out a sigh. He radioed in to dispatch to let them know he was making a traffic stop. Westbrook for stopping a vehicle, suspicious driving near the old library. The dispatcher acknowledged him with a crackle of static. David grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of his patrol car. The air was chilly, biting at his ears. He adjusted his belt, making sure his radio and his other gear were secure. He walked up to the driver's side of the Thunderbird, keeping a slight angle in his walk just like they taught him in the academy. You never walk straight up to the window. You stay back just a bit in case the driver decides to do something stupid. He shined his flashlight through the driver's window. The glass was tinted just a little bit, making it hard to see inside. The light cut through the darkness and hit the driver. It was a man. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s. He was wearing a dark jacket and a collared shirt, like he was coming home from a business meeting or a fancy dinner. He didn't look like a teenager out for a joyride. The man didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. David tapped on the glass with his knuckles. "Roll down the window, please," he said, keeping his voice firm but polite. The window whirred down. The man inside looked at David, then reached over to the glove box without being asked. He pulled out a wallet and a piece of paper and handed them out the window toward David. "Here you go, officer," the man said. His voice was calm, deep, and confident. "Is there a problem?" David took the items. He held the license up to his flashlight, blocking the glare with his hand so he could read the name. The photo matched the face inside the car. The address was local. It was a standard Connecticut driver's license. Then, David looked at the registration for the car. It was a beige Ford Thunderbird, matching the plates. The name on the registration matched the name on the license. It was a clean stop. Or it should have been. David looked from the license to the man's face. There was something weird about the guy's demeanor. Most people, when they get pulled over at 2 in the morning, are either nervous, shaking, apologetic, or angry. This man was none of those things. He was perfectly still. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles were white. Even though he tried to act relaxed, "I noticed you were swerving a bit back there," Sir David said, handing the license back so he could run the numbers on his computer. "Just making sure you're okay to drive." "I'm perfectly fine," the man said quickly. "Just had a long day at the office. I'm a judge, you know. I was at the courthouse late reviewing some files. I'm just tired." He said the word judge like it was a shield. It was a power play. He was telling David, "You don't need to bother me. I'm one of the important people." David had seen this before. Politicians, local officials, Rich people who thought a badge or a title put them above the law. David nodded politely. I understand, sir. I'll be right back. He walked back to his patrol car and sat down. The heater felt good. He typed the license plate into the computer terminal mounted in the dashboard. He waited for the screen to load. The system was slow tonight. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Outside, the beige Thunderbird sat silent, its brake lights dim red spots in the dark. The computer finally beeped. The information flashed on the screen. The vehicle was registered to a Robert Brennan. The license came back valid, issued to Robert Brennan. The status was clean. No warrants, no flags, no criminal history. Robert Brennan. The name rang a bell in David's head. He thought for a second. There was a Judge Brennan in the district court. A big shot. Known for being tough, but fair. If this was that guy, David was definitely in for a lecture. He wrote a ticket for a minor swerve. David looked out the window at the Thunderbird again. He should just go back, tell the guy to drive safe, and let him go. It was the smart thing to do. It was the easy thing to do. But that feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. It was that same feeling he had gotten years ago when he pulled over a guy for a broken taillight and ended up finding a trunk full of stolen electronics. It wasn't anything the guy did or said. It was just a vibe. A feeling that the picture being painted didn't match the frame. He looked at the man through the binoculars he kept in the car. The judge was sweating. David could see a bead of sweat rolling down the man's temple, even though the car was probably cold. The man kept looking in his rearview mirror, not at David, but past him, as if he was checking to see if anyone else was coming. Why would a judge be nervous about a simple traffic stop if he had nothing to hide? Why would he be sweating in the middle of a cold night? David picked up his radio. Dispatch, this is Westbrook 4. Go ahead, Westbrook 4. I need you to run a double check on this vehicle. I want to make sure the VIN isn't reported as stolen or cloned. Just a hunch. Stand by, Westbrook 4. Running it now. David waited. The seconds ticked by. He watched the Thunderbird. He saw the man's head drop forward, then snap back up. Was he nodding off? Or was he nervous? Dispatch came back. Westbrook 4. The VIN is clean. Matches the registration. No stolen report? You're good to go. David sighed. He grabbed his ticket book and his flashlight. He was being paranoid. It was just a tired judge driving home. He felt a little silly for holding the guy up. He opened the door to go finish the stop, apologize for the delay, and send the man on his way. But as he stepped out of the car, he saw the driver's door of the Thunderbird open. The man stepped out. He didn't wait for David. He walked around the front of the car and stood near the hood. He was acting aggressive. That was very strange behavior for a judge. Is there a problem, officer? The man shouted across the gap between the cars. I told you who I am. I have a meeting at 8 in the morning. I need to go. David walked toward him, keeping his hand near his belt but not on his gun. Sir, please get back in your vehicle. I haven't finished the stop. I finished it for you, the man snapped. You ran my plates. You know who I am? Am I under arrest? No, sir, David said. But I need you to sit back in the car. The man didn't move. He stared at David with eyes that looked hard, almost desperate. There was a flash of something in those eyes that wasn't annoyance. It was panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. And in that split second, David's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't right. The computer said one thing, but his eyes, his experience, and his gut said another. If he walked away now, something bad was going to happen. He didn't know what, but he couldn't let this car leave. David stopped walking. He looked the man in the eye. Sir, turn around and put your hands on the hood of the car. The judge laughed, but it was a dry, shaky sound. You're arresting me? You're arresting a judge for swerving? Do you know who I am? I know who you say you are, David said, his voice dropping an octave, getting serious now. Right now, I need you to turn around and put your hands on the car. The air between them crackled with tension. The quiet suburban street suddenly felt like a dangerous place. The man didn't move, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. David knew he had crossed a line. He was about to arrest the most powerful man in town on a hunch, and if he was wrong, his career was over. But as he looked at the sweat on the man's lip and the fear in his eyes, David knew he had never been more right about anything in his life. The tension in the air felt heavy, like the sky before a bad storm. David Springer stood his ground on the asphalt, his hand resting near his belt but not touching his weapon. The man who claimed to be Judge Brennan was staring at him, his face turning a shade of red that was visible even under the dim streetlights. The laugh that had escaped the man's throat a moment ago had died out, replaced by a look of pure indignation. "You must be out of your mind," the man said, his voice shaking not with fear now, but with anger. He pointed a finger at David, stepping closer. "I am not going to put my hands on the hood of my own car. I am a judge in the Superior Court. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now? When I walk into that station tomorrow morning, your badge is going to be in a pile on the chief's desk." David didn't blink. He had heard threats before. He had been yelled at by drunk drivers, CEOs, and teenagers who thought they knew the law better than he did. But this was different. The anger was real, but there was something underneath it, something frantic. The man wasn't just offended. He was desperate to get back into his car and drive away. That was the red flag that kept David from backing down. Innocent people, even angry innocent people, didn't usually try to intimidate an officer into letting them leave the scene. "Sir," David said, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage, "I have given you a lawful order. If you do not comply, I will have to use force. Please turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." The man's eyes went wide. He looked at David, then looked down the empty road, checking for witnesses again. "This is harassment," he spat. "I am calling my lawyer." He reached into his jacket pocket. "Stop." David barked, taking a step back and reaching for the handle of his radio, ready to call for backup immediately. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The man froze. He slowly pulled his hand out of his pocket, holding it up, palm open. "I was getting my phone," he said, his voice sounding suddenly smaller, almost like a child caught doing something wrong. "I don't care what you were getting," David said. "You do not reach into your pockets when an officer has given you a command. Turn around." It seemed like hours passed in those few seconds, but it was probably only 10 or 15. The man stood there, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling under his expensive jacket. He was weighing his options. He knew that if David put handcuffs on him, the game was up, whatever game he was playing. But he also knew he couldn't outrun a radio. He couldn't fight a cop without making things 1,000 times worse. Finally, the man's shoulders slumped. He turned around slowly and put his hands on the hood of the Thunderbird. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," he whispered toward the windshield. David moved in quickly. He grabbed the man's wrists, one by one, and pulled them behind his back. He felt the man's muscles tense up, as if he was about to pull away, but then he relaxed. David snapped the handcuffs on. They clicked shut with a metallic sound that echoed in the quiet night. The ratchet sound was final. It was a sound that changed lives forever. "Robert Brennan," David said, reading the name off the license he had tucked in his own pocket. "You are under arrest." "Under arrest for what?" The man shouted, twisting his head to try to look at David. "For driving my own car?" "For being tired?" "This is insane. You can't arrest a judge for a traffic violation." "I am arresting you for suspicion of motor vehicle theft," David said, loud and clear. The man went rigid. "Theft? It's my car. Look at the registration. You ran the plates." "Something isn't adding up," David said firmly. He grabbed the man by the arm and guided him toward the patrol car. "We are going to the station to sort this out." "You're crazy," the man kept repeating. "You are absolutely crazy. My name is Robert Brennan. I live at 42 Maple Drive. Check my wallet. Call my wife. We'll do all of that at the station," David said. He helped the man into the back seat of the patrol car. The man ducked his head to get in, then sat down heavily on the plastic bench seat. David closed the door, locking the man inside. For a moment, David stood alone by the side of the road. The Thunderbird sat there, empty, its engine still ticking as it cooled down. David let out a long breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at his hands. They were trembling just a little bit. He had just arrested one of the most powerful men in the state based on a gut feeling. If this really was Judge Brennan, and if this really was just a simple mistake, David knew he was finished. No police chief could survive the political heat of arresting a judge for no reason on a Tuesday morning. He walked back to his car and got into the driver's seat. The air inside smelled like the fast food he had eaten earlier and the faint scent of coffee. In the back seat, the man was leaning forward, his face close to the metal wire mesh that separated the front and back seats. "Officer," he said, his voice changing. It wasn't shouting anymore. It was trying to be reasonable, friendly. "Look, let's just forget this. I understand you were doing your job. You were being cautious. I appreciate that. Really, just take these cuffs off. Let me drive home and I'll put in a good word for you. You were just being diligent." David looked in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything. He started the car and put it into drive. "I'm serious," the man pressed. "I don't want you to lose your job. You seem like a good kid. Just let me go." David ignored him. He picked up the radio handset. "Dispatch. This is Westbrook 4. "Go ahead, Westbrook 4, the dispatcher replied. "I am transporting one male to the station. I need you to contact the watch commander and inform him I have a Judge Brennan in custody." There was a long pause on the radio line. David could imagine the dispatcher looking at the radio in confusion, maybe taking her headset off to show someone else what she had just heard. "Copy." Westbrook 4, the dispatcher's voice came back, sounding hesitant. "Did you say Judge Brennan?" "Affirmative," David said. "Suspected vehicle theft." 10-4. Standing by, David put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. He left the Thunderbird parked there. He would have to call a tow truck later to impound it as evidence. As he drove down the dark streets, the man in the back seat stopped talking. He sat back, his face shadowed. Staring out the window at the passing trees, the police station was a low brick building on the edge of town. Usually at this hour, the parking lot was mostly empty. Maybe with a couple of patrol cars belonging to the night shift guys writing reports, but as David pulled in, he saw the lights were on in the front office. He could see silhouettes moving around behind the glass doors. He parked the car and opened his door. The sudden quiet of the night returned. He opened the back door and helped the man out. The man was quiet now, his jaw set tight. They walked toward the entrance. Before they even reached the door, it flew open. Sergeant Miller, a large man who usually slept in the back office during the night shift, stormed out. He looked like he had just woken up and was furious about it. "Springer," Miller yelled. "What in the hell is going on? I got a call from the dispatcher saying you arrested the judge. Tell me she misheard you." David stopped walking. He felt small under Miller's glare. "No, Sergeant. I arrested him. He was acting suspicious. I believe he may have stolen the vehicle or is impersonating the judge." Miller looked past David at the man standing in handcuffs. The man lifted his head and looked Miller dead in the eye. "Sergeant," he said, his voice commanding, "I demand you release me immediately. This officer is incompetent. He has handcuffed me in front of my own neighborhood. This is a disgrace." Miller's face turned pale. He looked at the man, then back at David. "Officer, uncuff him. Right now." David hesitated. He felt his stomach drop. This was the moment every cop dreads being countermanded by a supervisor in front of a suspect. But he stood his ground. "Sergeant, I can't do that." He tried to reach into his pocket. He was sweating profusely. "He knew I was a cop, but acted like he was terrified. It doesn't add up. I don't care if it adds up." Miller shouted, spit flying from his mouth. "That is Judge Brennan. Get those cuffs off him before I have your badge." The man in the cuffs smiled, a thin, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Smart man, Sergeant. Now, take me inside. I need to use your phone." David looked at his sergeant. He knew if he took the cuffs off, the man would leave, and David would never know the truth. But he also knew he couldn't physically fight his own sergeant. With a heavy sigh, David reached for his keys. "I'm noting my objection in the log," David said quietly. "Nobody cares about your log right now, Springer." Miller yelled, "Open the cuffs." David inserted the key into the handcuffs. The metal sprang open. The man pulled his hands away, rubbing his wrists dramatically, even though the cuffs hadn't been tight. He straightened his jacket and smoothed his hair, instantly transforming back into a man of authority. "Thank you, Sergeant," the man said. "Officer, I hope you enjoy your unemployment." He walked past them both, head held high, and marched into the police station like he owned the building. Sergeant Miller turned to David, his face purple with rage. "Get in my office now. You are done, son. You are absolutely done." David stood there for a second, looking at the open door where the judge had disappeared. He knew he had just made a powerful enemy, and his career was likely hanging by a thread. But as he looked at the empty parking lot, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he had been right. Asterisk. The inside of the police station was usually a place of calm boredom at night. But tonight, it felt like a hornet's nest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, clinical white light over everything. David stood in the middle of the squad room, feeling like he was shrinking while the room around him grew. The man who claimed to be Judge Brennan was sitting in a chair usually reserved for detectives, looking completely at ease. He was on the phone, his voice calm and authoritative as he spoke to someone important, probably the mayor or the police chief. Sergeant Miller was pacing back and forth in front of David, his face a shade of red that looked unhealthy. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, clearly stressed out of his mind. Arresting a judge was not just a mistake. In the world of law enforcement, it was a political earthquake. Miller knew his own job was on the line, just as much as David's was. "I don't know what you were thinking, Springer," Miller hissed, stopping his pacing to get right in David's face. "Actually, I know you weren't thinking. You let your ego get in the way. You saw a fancy car, and you wanted to throw your weight around. You just had to ruin the night for everyone, didn't you?" "It wasn't about ego, Sergeant," David said, his voice quiet. He felt exhausted, the adrenaline from the traffic stop wearing off and leaving him feeling drained. He was sweating. It's 40 degrees outside. He was nervous. He reached for his pocket. He reached for his phone to call his lawyer. Miller shouted, throwing his hands up. "That's what innocent people do when a cop goes crazy on them. You humiliated him. You handcuffed him in front of God and everybody. The chief is driving down here right now. He was asleep in his bed, Springer. He was asleep until you decided to play detective." David looked over at the man on the phone. The judge laughed softly at something the person on the other end said. It was a casual laugh, the kind of laugh you have with an old friend. David stared at him, trying to find a crack in the armor, a sign of the nervous man he had seen on the roadside. But the man on the phone was a completely different person. He was composed, confident, and angry. He was exactly what a judge should be. The front door of the station flew open, and the chief of police stormed in. He didn't look happy. He walked straight past David without even glancing at him and went immediately to the judge, shaking his hand and nodding apologetically. They spoke in hushed tones for a few minutes. The chief looked back at David a couple of times, shaking his head each time. It was a look of pure disappointment. Finally, the chief turned around. He walked over to where David and Miller were standing. The air in the room seemed to get even heavier.
"Officer Springer,"
the chief said. His voice was low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea the amount of trouble you have caused tonight?" David stood up straight. "I was following procedure, sir. I believed a crime was occurring." "You believed a crime was occurring?" The chief let out a short, sharp laugh. "You pulled over a judge for weaving. You couldn't just give him a warning? You couldn't just tell him to go home and sleep it off? You had to arrest him for grand theft auto?" "The behavior didn't match the situation, sir," David insisted. He knew the car was registered to him, but he acted like he was terrified of being caught. "He was terrified because you were acting like a maniac with a gun." The chief yelled, "Miller, take his badge and his gun. Put him on administrative leave, effective immediately." Felt like a punch to the stomach. David reached for his belt and unclipped the badge that he had worn with pride for over a decade. He placed it on the desk in front of him. Then he took his service weapon out of its holster, checked that the chamber was clear, and placed it next to the badge. It was a surreal moment. He had seen other cops get fired or suspended, but he never thought he would be the one standing there, stripped of his identity in a matter of seconds. "Leave the premises." "Springer," the chief said, turning his back. "We will contact you about your hearing." David nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. There was no point. He turned and walked toward the door. As he passed the chair where the judge was sitting, the man looked up. He hung up the phone and looked David right in the eye. There was no fear there now, only a cold, smug satisfaction. It was the look a predator gives to prey that has been trapped. "It's a shame, son," the man said, his voice smooth. "You could have had a real career in this town." David stopped. He wanted to say something. He wanted to grab the man and shake him until the truth came out. But he knew that would just be the final nail in his coffin. Instead, he just kept walking. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool night air. The next few days were a blur for David. He sat at home, staring at the television, watching the news. The story was everywhere. Local news channels were running it as their top story. Judge wrongfully arrested by Westbrook police. They showed a picture of the judge standing on the steps of the courthouse, looking dignified and wronged. They showed a blurry picture of David walking out of the station. Head down, the newspapers called it a gross abuse of power. Editorial writers demanded that David be fired immediately. The phone at his house rang constantly, but he didn't answer it. He knew it would be reporters or friends asking him what he was thinking. He didn't know how to explain it. How do you explain a feeling in your gut? How do you explain that the man's eyes didn't match his words? He sounded crazy, even to himself. His wife, Karen, tried to be supportive, but he could see the worry in her eyes. They had 2 kids and a mortgage. Losing his job wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. "You'd have to fight this, Dave," she told him on the 3rd day, putting a hand on his shoulder while he sat at the kitchen table. "You have to tell them about the notebook." "I didn't see any notebook, Karen," David said, rubbing his temples. "I just had a feeling." A feeling isn't going to stand up in a hearing. But David wasn't the type of man to just roll over and play dead. He knew he had messed up the arrest. Maybe he should have waited for backup. Maybe he should have been more patient. But he knew deep down in his bones that he was right about the man. He started to think. He replayed the night in his head over and over again. He remembered searching the car briefly before impounding it. He hadn't found anything obvious. No drugs, no weapons, no stolen goods. But he remembered the man's reaction when David asked to search the glove box. He had hesitated. He had said there's nothing in there, but he had tightened up. Why? If you are a judge and you have nothing to hide, you don't care if a cop looks in your glove box. David stood up from the kitchen table. He went to his office and dug out his old notebook from the shift. He had written down the license plate number and the VIN from the dashboard. He looked at the time. It was late afternoon. The police station would be winding down, but the impound lot would still be open for an hour or so. "I have to go out for a while," David told Karen. He grabbed his jacket and his car keys. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Back to the station," he said. "If I'm going down, I'm not going down without looking one last time." David drove to the police station. He parked his personal car down the street, not wanting to go into the main lot. He walked around the back to the Sally Port, the secure garage where they kept impounded vehicles. The officer at the gate was a young kid, new to the job. He looked at David nervously. He knew who David was. Everyone knew the guy who had arrested the judge. "I can't let you in, sir," the kid said. "You're on leave. The chief said you aren't allowed on the property." "I just need 5 minutes," David said. "I need to check the inventory on the Thunderbird. I think I missed something. Just let me look at the car. I won't touch anything. I just want to look." "Can't." "Officer Springer," the kid said, shaking his head. David sighed. He didn't want to get the kid in trouble. "Look, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right, you don't want to be the guy who stopped the truth from coming out. Just give me 5 minutes. If the chief asks," I broke in. The kid looked at David, then at the clock on the wall. He bit his lip. 5 minutes. And if you find anything, you call me immediately. "You don't touch anything without me." "Deal," David said. The kid buzzed the gate open. David walked into the cool concrete garage. It smelled like exhaust fumes and old tires. The beige Ford Thunderbird was parked in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. It looked like a normal car. Just a rich man's toy. David walked up to it slowly. He stood by the driver's door, looking in through the glass. He put his hand on the handle. It was unlocked. He opened the door and leaned inside. The smell of leather hit him. It smelled expensive. He reached toward the glove box. His hands were shaking a little bit. If he didn't find anything, this was truly the end. He popped the latch and let the door fall open. Inside was the manual, some napkins, and a pair of sunglasses. Nothing suspicious. David felt his heart sink. He had been so sure he started to close the glove box, but then he stopped. He noticed something odd about the car's manual. It was thick, but it didn't look quite right. He pulled it out. It was the manual for the car, but it looked like it had been hollowed out slightly. The pages in the middle were glued together. David's pulse quickened. He used his thumbnail to pry the glued pages apart. They were stiff, but they started to give way. As the pages peeled back, he saw a thin sheaf of papers hidden inside the hollowed-out book. He pulled them out. They weren't car documents. They were parking receipts. Lots of them. From different cities, not just Westbrook. David scanned them. They were dated over the last 3 months. They were from parking garages near banks and jewelry stores. And there, hidden at the back of the stack, was a small, black notebook. David flipped it open. It was filled with handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a log. Times, dates, license plates, and descriptions of security guards. And on the last page there was a name. It was a list of aliases. Brennan was at the top of the list. But below it, there were 5 other names. "Got you," David whispered. He slammed the notebook shut. He looked up at the security camera in the corner of the garage, knowing he was being recorded. He didn't care. He turned and walked back toward the gate, the notebook in his pocket. The game had just changed. David's heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears as he walked out of the impound garage. The notebook felt heavy in his pocket, like a hot coal that he couldn't drop. The young officer at the gate looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for an explanation. David just nodded a silent thank you and kept walking. He didn't stop until he was inside his car, parked down the street where no one could see him. He locked the doors and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 days. He pulled the small, black notebook from his pocket and turned on the interior light. The pages were filled with tight, scribbled handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a log. Dates, times, locations. David flipped through it, his eyes scanning the entries. Most of it looked like gibberish at first, codes and numbers that didn't make sense to him. But then he saw the names. There was a list of names on the 3rd page. They weren't just random names. They were all aliases. Next to each name was a description of a vehicle and a license plate number. Brennan was at the top of the list, with the description of the beige Thunderbird. Below that, there were other names, fake identities for other cars. This man hadn't just pretended to be a judge. He had a whole collection of identities. David's hands trembled as he turned the page. This was it. This was the proof he needed to clear his name. But then he stopped. He looked up from the book and out the windshield at the dark street. He realized he couldn't just take this to the police station. The chief had already made up his mind. The chief was angry, and he was under pressure from the city to make this go away. If David walked in there with a book he found while breaking into the impound lot, they would say he planted it. They would say he was desperate and trying to frame the judge to save his job. He needed someone neutral. He needed someone higher up. David started the car and drove. He didn't go to the station. He drove to the next county over, to the office of the state police. It was a longer drive, and it gave him time to think. He kept glancing at the passenger seat, making sure the notebook was safe. His mind was racing. If this man wasn't the real judge, where was the real judge? And what kind of criminal goes to the trouble of impersonating a judge just to drive around at night? When he arrived at the state police barracks, the building was quiet. David walked in, feeling like a stranger in his own profession. He went to the front desk and asked to speak to a detective who specialized in major crimes. He didn't name drop, he just said it was urgent. 10 minutes later, a tall man with gray hair and a tired face walked into the waiting room. This was Detective Reynolds. He looked David up and down, recognizing the face from the news, but not the man. "Officer Springer," Reynolds said, crossing his arms. "The cop who arrested the judge. I've been reading about you. They say you're on administrative leave." "I am," David said. "And I'm probably going to be fired. But I'm not crazy, Detective. I found something." Reynolds sighed. He looked like he had a million better things to do. "Officer, you need to go through your union rep. If you have a grievance, you file it. You don't come here at 10 o'clock at night. This isn't a grievance," David said. He reached into his pocket and put the notebook on the desk between them. "This is evidence." Reynolds looked at the book. He didn't touch it. "Where did you get that?" "I went back to the impound lot," David admitted. "I knew something was off. I searched the car again. It was hidden inside the hollowed-out owner's manual in the glove box." Reynolds stared at him. "You tampered with an impounded vehicle? Springer, do you know how that looks? You just handed this man a lawsuit on a silver platter." "Read it," David said, his voice steady. "Just read one page. Look at the aliases. Look at the dates." Reynolds hesitated. He was a good cop, and even though he thought David was a loose cannon, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the notebook and opened it. He frowned. He flipped a page. Then his eyebrows shot up. He sat down in the chair next to David. "Where was this found again?" Reynolds asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "In the glove box," David said. "The guy was sweating when I pulled him over because he knew if I searched the car, I'd find that." He was terrified. Reynolds didn't say anything for a long time. He read the entries carefully. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Reynolds. I need you to run a name for me, quietly. Don't put it in the computer yet." Paused, reading from the book. "Robert Brennan. But I need you to cross-reference it with these other names here. Michaels, O'Shea Anderson." "Yes!" David waited, holding his breath. The silence in the room was deafening. Reynolds listened to the person on the other end. His face got serious. "And the last confirmed sighting of the real Brennan?" "Okay, got it, thanks." He hung up the phone and looked at David. The skepticism was gone from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, alert look. "The real Judge Brennan," Reynolds said slowly, "was reported missing by his wife 3 days ago. She filed a report, but it got buried because he's known for taking sudden trips and disconnecting his phone to work on cases. The local department was treating it as a voluntary absence." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Missing? For 3 days?" 3 days, Reynolds confirmed. "That matches the timeline in this book. The man driving that car isn't the judge. He's using his identity to pass through police checks without raising suspicion." "Why?" David asked. "Why go to all that trouble?" "I don't know yet," Reynolds said, closing the notebook. "But these notes, these aren't just random doodles. These are surveillance logs. Look here. He's noting shift changes. He's noting when armored cars arrive at banks. He's planning something big. He's using the authority of a judge to get close to targets he couldn't touch otherwise." Reynolds stood up. He slipped the notebook into an evidence bag he grabbed from his desk. "You did good, Springer. Stupid, but good. You broke about a dozen protocols tonight, but you might have just saved a lot of lives." "What happens now?" David asked. "Now we pick him up," Reynolds said, "but we do it carefully. If this guy is as professional as this book suggests, he might have eyes on the police station. He might know you're suspended. He probably thinks he won. We need to use that." Reynolds walked over to a map on the wall. "The impound lot is near the station. The car is there. But where is the man?" "He was let go," David said. "He was at the station talking to the chief when I left. The chief probably gave him a ride home." "No," Reynolds said, thinking out loud. "A guy like that, a guy who plays a role, he wouldn't want to go back to the judge's house. The wife is there. He can't fool her. He's probably staying in a hotel or a safe house, somewhere he can control the environment." Asterisk Reynolds made a phone call to the local police chief, David's boss. David could hear the conversation. Reynolds was telling the chief that they had credible evidence that the man in custody was an imposter involved in a federal investigation. He told the chief to stay calm and not to alert the man. The chief's voice was audible through the phone, yelling and denying it, but Reynolds shut him down. "Chief, this is no longer your case. This is a matter of national security. You do exactly as I say, or you'll be interfering with a federal investigation." David watched as Reynolds took control. It was impressive. The state police detective didn't care about politics or hurt feelings. He only cared about the truth. "Okay," Reynolds said, hanging up the phone. "Here's the plan. We can't just arrest him. We need to catch him in the act, or catch him with his accomplices. The book mentions a meeting tonight at the old warehouse district by the docks. It's code, but it matches a pattern. You want me to go?" David asked. "I'm suspended." "You're the only one who knows what he looks like up close," Reynolds said. "You're the only one who spotted the fake. I need you with us, but you stay in the back. You don't make a move unless I say so. You're just an observer, got it?" "Got it," David said. He felt a surge of adrenaline. He was back in the game. Not as a cop, but as the one person who knew the truth. They walked out to Reynolds' unmarked car. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. As they drove toward the warehouse district, David thought about the man in the judge's robe. He thought about the arrogance, the way he looked at David like he was dirt. David felt a grim satisfaction. The man thought he had one. He thought he had outsmarted the system, but he hadn't counted on a stubborn patrol officer who didn't know when to quit. The warehouse district was dark and quiet. Massive brick buildings loomed over the street, shadows stretching out like long fingers. Reynolds killed his lights and coasted to a stop behind a row of abandoned train cars. "Wait here," Reynolds whispered. They got out of the car. The air smelled like salt water and rust. Reynolds signaled to a team of agents who were hiding in the darkness. David stayed low, watching from behind the car. Minutes ticked by. Nothing happened. Then a pair of headlights cut through the gloom. A car turned the corner and moved slowly toward one of the warehouses. It was the beige Thunderbird. It parked right in front of a large metal door. The driver's side door opened, and the judge stepped out. He wasn't wearing his robes anymore. He was wearing a black tactical jacket and jeans. He looked completely different, dangerous, calculating. He walked to the door and knocked 3 times. David held his breath. This was it. The moment the mask came off, the cold night air in the warehouse district seemed to freeze in David's lungs as he watched the scene unfold from behind the rusted train car. The man who had been sitting in the police station acting like a superior judge just a few hours ago was now dressed in black tactical gear, looking more like a cat burglar than a servant of the law. David pressed his back against the cold metal of the train, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't supposed to be here, technically, but he knew he couldn't just sit at home. He had to see this through to the end. Detective Reynolds was crouched a few yards away, signaling to the other team members hidden in the shadows. Everyone had their radios in their ears, waiting for the order to move. The big metal door of the warehouse creaked open slowly, and a sliver of yellow light fell across the pavement. The man posing as the judge walked inside, and the door slammed shut behind him.
Ow.
Reynolds whispered into his radio, "Go, go, go." The quiet night was instantly shattered. Flashlights cut through the darkness, and boots pounded against the pavement as the tactical team swarmed the warehouse door. David stayed put for a moment, his training kicking in. He was the support, the observer. But when he heard the sound of glass breaking and shouting from inside, he couldn't stay back. He drew his backup weapon, the small pistol he carried legally even when off-duty on, ran toward the building. By the time David got to the open door, the entry team was already inside. The warehouse was vast, filled with towering shelves and old machinery. The smell of oil and dust hung heavy in the air. Shouts echoed off the high ceiling. "Police! Get down! Hands where I can see them." David moved carefully, keeping his weapon pointed down but ready. He saw officers clearing the aisles one by one. He followed the noise toward the back of the warehouse. There, In a small office that had been set up with tables and computers, he found Reynolds. The detective was standing over the fake judge, who was handcuffed and sitting on the floor, looking furious. "You have no idea who you're messing with," the man was shouting. "I am a federal judge. You are interfering in an undercover operation." Reynolds just laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had heard too many lies. "We found the notebook, pal. We know about the aliases. We know you're not Brennan. Where is he? Where is the real judge?" The man spit on the floor. "I want my lawyer." David walked into the room. When the man saw David, his face twisted in hatred. "You," he hissed. "This is your fault. You just couldn't let it go." David ignored him. He looked around the room. There were maps on the tables, blueprints of banks, and photos of armored trucks. It was a command center for a robbery crew. But something was missing. If this guy was the mastermind, where were the accomplices? And more importantly, where was the man whose identity he had stolen? "He's not talking," Reynolds said to David. "But we found a rental agreement for a cabin up in the mountains. About an hour from here. It matches a credit card receipt we found in his pocket." "He wouldn't keep the real judge here," David said, looking at the sophisticated setup. "Too much risk. The cabin makes sense. Isolated. We have a team heading there now," Reynolds said. "But I have a feeling this isn't the end of it." Suddenly a shout came from the front of the warehouse. "Officer down. We need a medic at the front entrance." David and Reynolds both spun around. The ambush hadn't come from inside. It had come from outside. The remaining members of the gang must have been watching the warehouse. David didn't think. He just moved. He ran out of the office and down the long aisle toward the front door. He could hear the crackle of gunfire outside. When he burst out the front door, he saw two officers pinned down behind a stack of pallets. A black van was parked across the lot, and a man was leaning out the side door, firing an automatic rifle toward the police. The bullets were chipping away at the concrete, sending dust flying everywhere. David needed to stop that van. He looked around and saw an old forklift parked nearby with the keys still in the ignition. It was a long shot, but it was the only cover he had. He jumped into the seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life with a loud cough. He slammed the lever forward, and the heavy machine lurched across the pavement. The man in the van didn't see the forklift coming until it was too late. David steered the heavy machine directly into the side of the van, using the large metal forks like a battering ram. There was a screech of tearing metal as the forks punched into the van's sliding door. The impact jerked the van sideways, throwing the gunman off balance. The rifle went flying, skidding across the pavement. "Police, drop your weapon," David yelled, jumping out from behind the forklift seat. The gunman, dazed and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, looked at the heavily armed tactical team now swarming around the van. He raised his hands. With the outside threat neutralized, the chaos began to settle. David leaned against the forklift, breathing hard. His hands were shaking again, but this time it was from the rush of adrenaline. He looked up to see Reynolds walking toward him, a wide grin on his face. "You know," Reynolds said, looking at the crumpled side of the van, "for a suspended cop, you're pretty handy." "Just doing my job," David said. Wiping grease and dust from his forehead an hour later, David was sitting in the back of an ambulance, getting a bandage wrapped around a scrape on his arm he hadn't even noticed. The sun was starting to come up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was going to be a beautiful day. Reynolds walked over, holding a cup of coffee. He handed a second cup to David. "We found him," he said quietly. David looked up. "The real judge?" Reynolds nodded. "He was in the cabin, tied up in a closet. Dehydrated and scared, but he's alive. They were keeping him there just in case they needed his fingerprints or a voice confirmation. The impersonator was an ex-con named Michael O'Shea. He's been doing this for years, stealing identities to plan heists." David took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and bitter, but it tasted like victory. "So it wasn't just a hunch," Reynolds said. "It wasn't a hunch. You saw something nobody else saw. You saw through the mask." The local police chief arrived a few minutes later. He looked tired, and he wouldn't make eye contact with David at first. He walked over to the ambulance, shuffling his feet. The news trucks were starting to arrive, setting up their cameras on the perimeter. "Springer," the chief said. Finally looking up, "Chief," David replied. The chief cleared his throat. He looked like he had swallowed something unpleasant. "I owe you an apology." Reynolds explained everything. The notebook. The kidnapping. "I shouldn't have suspended you. I should have listened." David looked at the chief. He thought about the humiliation of being stripped of his badge in front of everyone. He thought about the fear that he had lost his career forever. But looking at the chief now, he didn't feel anger. He just saw a man who had made a mistake under pressure. "It's okay, Chief," David said. "You were doing what you thought was right for the department. I was doing what I thought was right for the truth. I'm putting you back on active duty," the chief said. "Effective immediately. And Reynolds said he wants to write a commendation for you. Bravery in the line of duty." David smiled slightly. "I'll take the badge back, Chief. The commendation isn't necessary. I was just doing my job." A few days later, the story was all over the news. It was the kind of story people love. A mystery, a hero, and a happy ending. They showed footage of the fake judge being led away in handcuffs, looking nothing like the distinguished gentleman he had pretended to be. They showed the real Judge Brennan standing on the courthouse steps, shaking David's hand. The real judge was different than the fake one. He was older, frailer, and he had a kindness in his eyes that the imposter had lacked. When he shook David's hand in front of the cameras, he didn't let go right away. "You saved my life, officer," the judge said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was in that dark closet for 3 days. I thought I would never see my family again. You noticed something that trained federal agents missed. You have a gift, son." "I just paid attention, sir," David said, feeling a bit embarrassed by the spotlight. "No," the judge said, squeezing his hand tight. "You listened to your gut. You didn't let status or intimidation stop you from doing what was right. That is rare." Life slowly returned to normal for David. He got his badge back, and the guys at the station treated him differently now. There was a new level of respect in their eyes when he walked into the roll call room. The teasing stopped. He wasn't just Springer anymore. It was the guy who caught the judge. One evening, a week after the arrest, David was back on patrol. Driving the same streets he had driven the night of the traffic stop. It was a quiet night, just like before. He passed the spot where he had pulled over the beige Thunderbird. There was nothing there now, just an empty patch of asphalt. He thought about how close he had come to just letting the man go. If he had ignored the sweat, if he had ignored the nervousness, the real judge might still be in that cabin, or worse. A kidnapper and a thief would still be walking free, using the power of the law to break it. David tapped the steering wheel gently. He knew that most of the time police work was boring paperwork and traffic stops. But sometimes, in the middle of the night on a quiet street, it was about seeing the invisible thread of truth and pulling on it, no matter who got angry. He took a sip of his coffee and turned his car toward the highway. The shift was just beginning, and the world was asleep, save for one more night, because he was awake and he was watching.